Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a deep dive into an ancient 700-verse text and breaking it down into a highly structured visual journey. We are talking about the Bhagavad Gita, or often just called the Gita. It's this absolute powerhouse of a text that pulls together different strands of ancient India religious thought into this brilliant, gripping dialogue about life, duty, and basically the very nature of reality itself. Obviously, it is a massive topic, but we're going to go through it slide by slide to make these complex concepts incredibly clear and easy to grasp. What's really fascinating to think about is that this famous quote, right from the very dawn of the atomic age, was drawn straight from our source material today. When the physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer watched the first ever nuclear weapon detonate, his mind immediately went to verse 1132 of the Gita. I think it's just a really powerful reminder that we aren't dealing with some dusty, irrelevant manuscript here. It is a living, breathing philosophical framework. Some of the most brilliant minds in history have literally reached for it when trying to process the absolute extremes of human existence and moral consequence. All right, so here is our roadmap for today to see how a story about a war became a cornerstone of global philosophy. We're going to cover the battlefield of duty, look at the origins and ancient roots, explore the four paths of yoga, unpack the core metaphysics, and finish up with its global legacy and critiques. Let's get into it. Starting right off with Section 1, the battlefield of duty, and the hero's ultimate dilemma. Picture this for a second. You are staring down an opposing army, but you realize you are facing your own family, your most revered teachers, your childhood friends, all in this catastrophic winner-takes-all war. That visceral, high-stakes moment sets the stage. The Pandava prince, Arjuna, asks his charioteer to drive him right out into the center of the battlefield at Kurukshetra. But when he looks across the lines and realizes he's going to have to slaughter his own relatives, he is hit with this absolute crushing moral paralysis. He literally drops his bow. He questions the entire morality of the war and seriously considers just walking away. So he turns to his charioteer, who, by the way, just happens to be Krishna, an avatar of the divine, and asks for guidance. Basically, everything else in the Gita is Krishna's profound response to Arjuna's crisis. Now, to really grasp Krishna's answer, we have to establish a little vocabulary, starting with the absolute core concept of the text, dharma. Fundamentally, dharma means your duty, rightful action, or just the way things ought to be. But for Arjuna, Krishna is focusing on his swadharma, which is his specific personal duty as a warrior, or a kshatriya. Krishna is essentially telling him, look, you can't just abandon your role in society because you're terrified of the emotional toll. You have to perform your rightful action. But as we're going to see, it's really how he goes about that action that makes all the difference. Because here's the catch, fulfilling your dharma isn't just about keeping the gears of society turning. It's actually a crucial piece of a much larger cosmic puzzle designed to help you reach moksha, which is ultimate spiritual liberation and release from the cycle of rebirth. The text is doing something really clever here. It's neutralizing a massive tension. On one side, you have worldly duties that hold human society together. On the other side, you have these ascetics who completely check out of society to go find spiritual release. The Gita brilliantly argues that you don't actually need to run away to the forest to achieve moksha. You can find ultimate liberation right smack in the middle of your everyday life, just by fulfilling your dharma the right way. Moving right along to Section 2, Origins and Ancient Roots. Let's look at dating and authorship. So how did this text actually come together? Well, it evolved over a massive span of history as a small section of a much larger epic poem called the Mahabharata. Because it grew out of ancient oral traditions, pinning down an exact date is incredibly complex. But generally, scholars think the early philosophical roots started taking shape around the 5th or 4th century BCE, which makes sense as that was right when Buddhism and Jainism were starting to challenge the traditional norms. They estimate the first written compilation happened around the 2nd century BCE, with the final, polished, epic, Puranic Sanskrit version solidifying around the 3rd century CE. So it's very much a text that adapted over centuries. Which brings us to a really fascinating debate. Who actually wrote the thing? Hindu tradition has this beautiful story attributing the epic to the revered sage Vyasa, who legend says dictated the entire thing to the elephant-headed god Ganesha. Modern historians and linguists, on the other hand, look at it neutrally as a composite work. Because the text violently shifts gears between different philosophical styles. One minute it's highly analytical, the next it's passionately focused on devotion to a personal god. Scholars conclude it was basically woven together by multiple ancient authors over hundreds of years, attempting to harmonize competing religious paths. Let's jump back to the battlefield for Section 3, the four paths of yoga, or the ways to liberation. Okay, quick clarification. The word yoga here isn't about physical stretching or downward dog. It means a path of spiritual discipline. Krishna brilliantly offers four distinct paths to accommodate totally different human temperaments. If you're a really action-driven person, there's karma yoga. If you're highly emotional and loving, you have bhakti yoga. If you're deeply intellectual, there is jnana yoga. And if you're disciplined and want to experiment with your mind, there's raja yoga, the path of meditation. What modern interpreters like Swami Vivekananda heavily emphasize is that the Gita treats all of these paths as totally equal. They aren't in competition, they literally all converge at the exact same goal. And that perfectly tees up karma yoga. This specific quote is arguably one of the most famous, most quoted teachings in the entire text. It hits on a universally relatable struggle. How do you take the right action without being completely paralyzed by your craving for success? Krishna tells Arjuna, look, you have to fight, but you must completely detach yourself from the outcome. Whether you win or lose, live or die, that's irrelevant. It's called motiveless action. If you do your work flawlessly, just because it's the right thing to do, and you completely let go of all that anxiety about the reward or the fruits of your labor, that is how you find true inner freedom. Let's zoom out to the macro level for Section 4, Core Metaphysics and Themes. This is all about the nature of reality. To get Arjuna past his overwhelming fear of death, the text draws a really sharp philosophical line. On one side, we have Prakriti. This is all matter, including our physical bodies. It's totally transient. It's like a decaying statue. Eventually, it ends. But on the other side, we have the Atman, the true inner self. The Gita teaches that the Atman is eternal, pure, and absolutely indestructible. You can't cut it with weapons, you can't burn it with fire. Krishna is essentially telling Arjuna that his grief is misplaced because he's confusing the temporary physical bodies of his relatives with their eternal essence, which can literally never be killed. Then, to explain the psychological side of why we get so attached to this physical world, Krishna breaks our human tendencies down into three gunas. Basically, everything in nature is made up of a mix of these three qualities. Sattva is your purity, your light, your clarity. Rajas is all about movement, passion, and restless energy. And tamas is darkness, ignorance, and inertia. Krishna explains that our personalities are really just varying slices of these traits constantly interacting and battling it out. For a yogi, the ultimate goal is to learn how to just observe these traits without being controlled by them, and eventually transcend them entirely to find pure, unshakable calm. Finally, we hit Section 5, Global Legacy and Critiques. Let's look at how the modern world interprets all of this. So, the interpretation of the war itself, that is hotly debated. Some readers take it entirely literally, seeing the text as a theological justification for righteous battle and fulfilling your duty to the state. But a lot of really prominent figures completely reject that literal reading. Take Mahatma Gandhi, for instance. He actually called the Gita his spiritual dictionary, but he viewed the whole thing as an internal allegory. For Gandhi, the battlefield of Kurukshetra isn't a physical place, it's the human soul. And the massive armies, they just represent our higher impulses, constantly at war with our own inner evils and selfish desires. And there is a similarly intense debate over that concept of svadharma we talked about earlier. Traditional, orthodox views often tie this duty strictly to varna, meaning the rigid social caste system you happen to be born into. But move into the modern era, and neo-Hindu thinkers like Swami Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo argue for a much more universal, egalitarian reading. They interpret svadharma not as a birthright caste, but as your duty based on your natural aptitudes, your specific talents, or just your current situation in life, whether you're a teacher, a parent, or a soldier. Now, impartially reporting the historical critiques here, it is absolutely vital to note that the Gita has faced fierce opposition for its social implications. Prominent scholars and leaders like B.R. Ambedkar, who was born into a Dalit family and went on to become India's first law minister, heavily criticized the text. Ambedkar, along with historian D.D. Kosambi, argued that the Gita was basically utilized as a philosophical tool to defend and hold up unjust, rigid Brahminical caste hierarchies. The core critique is that by telling people to just dutifully accept their lot in life without complaining, the text fundamentally preserves social inequality, just dressed up as spiritual duty. Yet, despite thousands of years of profound debate, wildly varying interpretations, and some incredibly heavy critiques, these 700 standard verses have remarkably survived. The text has been translated hundreds of times into dozens of languages, making it one of the most studied and influential pieces of literature in human history. Whether you view it as a literal instruction manual for life, an allegory for your inner struggles, or a historical artifact of ancient social structures, its massive impact on the global mind is absolutely undeniable. Which leaves us with a pretty compelling question to chew on as we wrap up this explainer. When you hit a wall of moral paralysis, how do you navigate the battlefield of your own mind? And more importantly, can you ever truly separate your day-to-day actions from that desperate craving for the reward? It's a question a prince supposedly asked his charioteer thousands of years ago, and I'd argue it is just as incredibly difficult to answer today. Thanks so much for learning with us.